want so much to tell Lily how far we've come, you and I. And as the ball rolls back and forth, I want to tell her how very lucky she is. That for all of our difference, we are still the greatest nation on this good earth. And our strength lies in the men and women who go to work every day, who struggle to balance their family and their jobs, and who should never, ever be forgotten. I just hope that, like her grandparents and her great-grandparents before, that Lily goes on to raise her kids with the promise that echoes in homes all across America, that we can do better, and that's what this election is all about. Thank you very much.
"54-year-old Ann Richards, state treasurer of Texas, asked to stand and deliver at the Democratic National Convention and does so. Among other things, a scalpel-style attack on George Bush, describing the vice president as a man born with a silver foot in his mouth, who, to quote her, wants a job he can't get appointed to finally. Words of Ann Richards. She also called the Reverend Jesse Jackson a leader and a teacher. She promised that the Democrats would consider Social Security a pact that cannot be broken. She may be hearing those words played back to her and her ticket as the campaign heats up, because Republicans, among others, might want to know how there's any chance to balance the federal budget and fight the deficit if Social Security is not also considered something open and negotiable. But another subject for another day. Ann Richards now hears ringing in her ears the applause, rhythmic applause, and the eyes of Texas. With me in our CBS News anchor booth, Bruce Morton, our chief political correspondent. And Bruce, Ann Richards, among her chores, in addition to jibing at the very least at George Bush, was to set the themes for the fall campaign. And as you heard them and noted them, those themes are what?
So that we can get you...
Ann Richards wrote the speech herself. She said yesterday, these are my words, my speech rhythms, and they are. And I wouldn't suggest that she's a lady who reads the polls, but the polls all show that people think the United States is in pretty good shape today, but they're very worried about their children's America.
Excuse me, Bruce, 1 second. Hate to interrupt. We'll get back. Diane Sawyer is with Ann Richards on the podium. Diane?
That's right, Dan. Miss Richards, the reviews are going to be coming in soon. A big speech for you. Why don't we let the first review be yours?
Well, I hope what I did was open the door to the Democratic Party and invite America in. I really wanted to be able to have people know how I feel and what the experience has been in my life, and that it's important for young families out there to fight those battles and get involved.
So give yourself a grade.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't sure that my eye contact with the camera was all it should have been. It was a fabulous audience, and I fed off of that a lot, but I had a great time.
Thank you. Ann Richards. Dan, back to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And do me a favor telling you to don't worry about that eye contact. Don't worry about that eye contact.
Don't worry about that eye contact.
Thank you very much, Diane and Ann Richards. Bruce, I'm very sorry for that interruption, but we just had a moment to catch you before you got off, and I know you understand that. We were talking about the themes for the campaign in the fall. In addition to George Bush has basically a resume that is composed of jobs to which he was appointed. In addition to the theme that the Democratic Party is populist. This was a very populist approach to a keynote speech. What were the other themes?
Well, nobody's a liberal anymore. They've taken to calling that the L word. Everybody is a populist now or a progressive. But I started to say, I thought her eye contact was terrific, I should add. But, you know, the polls show people aren't so worried about today, but they're very worried about tomorrow. They think that children are going to live in a worse America, have a harder time than they did. And she went to those themes, talked about education, talked about children. I read a letter from this young couple that's worried whether it's ever going to be able to afford to send their kids to college. So that's one. She's striking themes that I think Michael Dukakis and Senator Benson will want to strike in the fall campaign. And the other, this is a party which for 20 years has been tarred as squishy soft or kooky or flaky or wild or soft on communism or whatever. Special interest party. Now, here's this mainstream lady talking about tossing a ball back and forth with her granddaughter and what a wonderful America she hopes that child will have. That's the least special interest little girl you're ever going to find.
Well, Bruce, the staff of Michael Dukakis has for several days now, when you ask them the question, how are you going to get elected when the economy is as good as it appears to be right now, at least if you read the papers, listen to evening news, and look at the statistics, and their answer has come back. It isn't that people are worried about so much worried about what they're doing now, but they are worried about the economic future. From what we heard from Ms. Richards tonight, they're going to hit that pretty hard as we go along.
Oh, I think so. They want this election to be about the management of the future, the management of economic change. And they are encouraged by polls that show people think that's important. People think drugs, another major issue on which Ms. Richards touched, is very important. People think the Democrats are the party that can do the better job of handling that. They think that George Bush's issues, who can deal with the Soviets and so forth, have paled somewhat in importance, and that this question of managing change is what's going to get them elected come November.
Bruce, thank you very much. And our CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention will continue with the Reverend Jesse Jackson here in our booth with us after these messages, so stay here with us.
This portion of CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention is sponsored by Citicorp and Citibank, already helping 1 in every 5 American families get what they want out of life. Citicorp, because Americans want to succeed, not just survive.
Joining me now in our CBS News anchor booth at the Democratic National Convention, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Reverend Jackson, this is what you've been doing all evening long, waving to your fans, friends, and supporters down there. But if I may, set the record straight for me. What is the deal?
Well, maybe the deal is not described. The basic issue of communications, inclusion, expansion, a signal. When Lord Benson was recommended for the ticket, it was a signal to Democrats lost to return home. For those Democrats who were the heart and soul of the party who never left, they felt abandoned. There was no signal that there was a role for their leadership to play. There was a place for them in the campaign, an expanded place in the DNC at the policy priority level of the campaign, not just the vote delivery level of the campaign. And though Governor Dukakis and I have not sought the level of personal animosity or meanness, we never really gotten down to the brass tacks of a structured relationship that will allow us to be a part of a broader team with common objectives. Today, with the help of Attorney Ron Brown and Paul Brontes, we were able to have that level of discussion, plus the events of the last week. And I feel that we came away from that meeting today a much expanded group, having made a commitment to make room for more people.
Does this include a role for you and those who've supported you in the transition and in the government, if there is to be a transition in the government with
That's a bit far off, but it stands to reason. If you're part of the campaign, you're part of the Democratic Party structure itself. If you win, you're part of the transition and you're part of the government. And so let's take it really one step at a time. We have a record number of people here, 18 to 24-year-olds. a record number of black and brown and Asian, Hispanic, young people, women, who are now involved. They want a place. And so, in some sense, Governor Dukakis has this obligation to send signals to them that he cares for them and he will make room for them. He did not campaign for their vote and therefore did not get it in some measure. Now it's time to put together a broader team, where we come from the various constituency groups, as it were, to a point of common ground. He made that gesture to the conservatives last week, which was a valid concern, but then there is this body of Democrats who in fact returned the U.S. Senate to our party. They must feel a comfort level as well.
Someone said to me today, watch the hostage situation and watch the assignment they give and that Reverend Jackson takes on the hostages. Anything to that, and if so, what do they mean?
Well, I'm not sure what they meant, but I know that just as when the plane went down, I feel an awesome sense of agony for the hostages. I felt it could signal a reaction or retaliation that could get them killed.
You're talking about the Iranian jet that was shot down by the U.S. Navy.
That's why I appeal so quickly for us to make the gesture of compensation, so to show that it really was an accident and we really do care about life. Now that UN Resolution 598 is going to be signed by the Iranians, maybe that's a window for us to make an appeal to gain their release. So I've talked, for example, with several Middle Eastern ambassadors today. I shall reach out to Lebanon and to Syria and to other people I know in the region, and hopefully we can seize this moment to make a breakthrough, but make a very basic appeal through political and religious leaders to try to gain the freedom of U.S. hostages, of Americans who are held hostage in Lebanon.
Is that the sort of assignment you would expect to get on a regular basis in a Dukakis administration?
Well, I certainly am not looking for a job and title and salary. I do want to serve. I do want to serve our government. I want to put a lot of focus on third world development. After all, when America and Russia meets, Reagan and Gorbachev is 1/8 of the human race. 7/8 are locked out. We must see our future, expansion, growth, and peace in that direction. And so focusing in some measure on Latin America, Middle East peace, and African development are certainly areas of interest of mine.
We have only a few seconds left. Ron Brown is or is not going to be co-chair of the Democratic National Committee with Paul Craig?
That decision has not been made. We did not get to that level of specifics today. We did focus on relationship, expansion, inclusion, and mutual support. And those are the kind of steps that will make us bigger, better, stronger, and those are keys to victory in November.
Reverend Jackson, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
And our CBS News coverage of the 1988 Democratic National Convention will continue in a moment.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 88 continues tonight from Atlanta, Georgia, the opening session of the Democratic National Convention. From CBS News Convention headquarters inside the Omni Arena, here again is Dan Rather.
And welcome back to Booming, and tonight boisterous and celebrating Atlanta and our CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention. If you're just joining us, among the highlights so far, the keynote speech by Texas State Treasurer Ann Richards. Straight talk, peppered with some down-home humor, and a somewhat mild attack on George Bush. At least that's the way it's described by the Democrats in this hall, a somewhat mild attack. The big story of the day, the show of unity between Michael Dukakis and the Reverend Jesse Jackson, even before the convention opened. Coming up this hour, an address by Jimmy Carter, the last Democrat to occupy the White House. Right now in our CBS News anchor booth, Eric Severide. Eric, good to have you with us. What did you think of the Ann Richards speech?
Well, I thought it was a speech that left this hall, if not excited, at least in a cheerful mood. It was a kind of a happy speech, a funny speech. Words are weapons, as they say, and this was not a cannonade like Governor Cuomo of 4 years ago, but it was a series of volleys of rather withering small arms fire, I think. So she will be famous for the 30 minutes, but more really. There's an afterglow to these electric moments in a person's life, like making a major speech at a major convention. And it will do a lot for her in the future, I would think. Now let me take you a moment in reference to that back to 48. Walter took you back to 52 a few minutes ago. Let me go a little further back. Philadelphia, 48, Harry Truman. He was at the nadir of his popularity in this country. It was a dead convention when they first gathered. It was brought to life by one speech, the keynote speech by Alben Barkley of Kentucky. And he just had them on their feet. I've never seen anything like it. The result was that Barkley went on the ticket as vice president because they would have done it by acclamation. Truman was trying to get on the phone to Justice Douglas on the West Coast to have him run with him. He couldn't have done it. The convention took it away. It was a case where the convention really decided and nominated a man. So he went on the ticket and they won. Well, Ann Richards' speech, of course, was sort of a back home on the farm speech, the poor but honest theme. Not a happiness speech exactly because they're not in power, not a doomsday speech. She's not saying all is lost under Republicans, but that we can do a great deal better in this country. It's a rather curious convention in spirit. It's not a gung-ho thing, not a New Frontiers, Great Society thing. I don't know of any slogan to you except competence and we can manage our assets better.
Well, that's a pretty good point. They don't really have a slogan, although Governor Dukakis has said it's time for a little competence.
You know, Dan, for several years I have occasionally made a lecture around the country under the title of America at Middle Age. And I think there's some validity to that notion. We are, of course, proud of our youth, but we're beginning to feel our limitations at home and what we're trying to do socially and abroad. We're still very hopeful, but people are apprehensive about the future, and that's what she has been saying in this speech. And it occurs to me that there is at least a faint similarity between what she said and what Gorbachev in Moscow has been saying about his country. That they're very powerful in the military sense, they are mighty indeed, but they are in a state of economic disrepair. They're much worse off than we are in that sense. But there's a comparison to be made. And so she has been emphasizing not our overextensions abroad, but our underextensions at home in dealing with things like AIDS and drugs and child care centers and health insurance and all those things, and jobs. And of course, if that kind of thing were the major preoccupation of politicians and people, be a lot safer world. And I think that is very much the theme of Jesse Jackson.
Well, Eric, we're going to take a break here for a moment. Appreciate you being with us, and we're going to see as we go along this week. But good point, that last one, because when the Reverend Jesse Jackson was in here a moment ago, just as he left, he said, listen, Dan, rather you keep talking about the Republican theme that the economy's in good shape, but the economy's good on the top, but the foundations are shaky. Thanks, Eric. And our CBS News coverage of this Democratic convention will continue with correspondent Ed Bradley and former President Jimmy Carter after this.
This portion of CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention is sponsored by Kellogg's Nutri-Grain cereal. Gives you the whole grain with no sugar and no preservatives. Nothing comes between you and its special taste. Nutri-Grain, dedicated to the ones we love.
Well, as we talk about keynotes and unity, as we have been doing here tonight at this Democratic convention, let's go to the floor so Ed Bradley can talk about some of that deal struck today between the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Michael Dukakis, and Lloyd Bentsen. Ed, I understand you've been talking to some people and come up with some information about what they agreed to and what they didn't agree to.
Dan, as you know, you've heard a lot of calls from particularly the people in the Jackson camp for the head of the man who's speaking now, Paul Kirk, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. They wanted to have him replaced. But when they've just managed to throw this blanket of unity over the convention, they don't want a divisive fight over his successor. So for the moment, the decision was made, we're told, that Kirk stays until January or February, and then he's gone to be replaced by someone more acceptable to Jackson. But in the meantime, probably on Friday when the DNC meets, they'll expand some of those at-large committees, put some of the Jackson people in there, and they'll create a new position of vice chairman. Now, this vice chairman will be in charge of voter registration and mobilization, which will be the most important role for Jesse Jackson in the fall. And they fully expect to have him on board, as they say, with all resources necessary.
Ed, when the Reverend Jesse Jackson was in here a few moments ago, he looked and sounded genuinely pleased about what had happened this morning. What, as much as anything, has him in that mood?
You know, there are two things, and the first is that he never had the kind of conversation, the kind of beginning of a relationship, if you will, with Governor Dukakis that he has now after that meeting. They feel for the first time that Governor Dukakis sees, if he doesn't agree with the way Jesse Jackson sees the campaign, and you have to understand that Jackson sees the campaign as bigger than him, as something that historical, that at least Governor Dukakis now sees how Jesse Jackson sees it. And that's important for them. It's the beginning of a relationship for him. And he feels that he'll have access, that if he's got an issue that he wants to raise, that he can get to Governor Dukakis without having to go around the bend. And any way you call it, that's called respect, and that's what he's looking for.
Brookline, Massachusetts meets Chicago and South Carolina, and it works. It's no small accomplishment what they've done today.
No, they've done, and they worked it out. You know, the thing that you hear on this floor more than anything else is that we want to win. And I've talked to people who are tough Jackson people who are not particularly happy with where he is, but they say, look, this is an intra-party fight, and we'd rather have it among ourselves. The big fight is against Bush in November, and we want to win that. So we're going to put out any fires that erupt in this hall.
Thanks, Ed. Now, I'm not so happy about what's been going on. We understand Maxine Waters from California. With her is Bill Plant. Bill?
Dan, there's no more forceful advocate for Jesse Jackson than Maxine Waters from California, the state chair for Jackson. She, as you know, was involved deeply in the touchy negotiations over the past couple of days. Ms. Waters, how can the Jackson delegates in California, the most numerous block of all the states, settle for what has happened? Why is today different than yesterday? Some of them aren't very happy.
Well, today is very important. If you saw the press conference that was held, Dukakis said for the first time, I respect Jesse Jackson. I need him. I need his constituency. I cannot win without him. He is an important part of this team.
Does this,
the first time.
Does this satisfy you?
Yes. As a matter of fact, not only did he say for the first time that Jesse Jackson was an important part of the team, he would be intricately involved at all levels of the decision making. He went further. We have now gotten our share of the Democratic National Committee. Jesse Jackson supporters will serve on all of the standing committees. We will have a new vice chair.
But these folks aren't on board yet, Ms. Waters.
If you were in the meeting last night, this afternoon with Jesse Jackson and his supporters, he was received very warmly. He talked with them. He talked about their noble cause and how they must move forward to do the work that's very important for all of those constituents back home who are poor, who are out of this. They were very accepting of that. What people have to understand is Jesse Jackson has credibility as a leader.
But there were no specifics announced today, or very few. It comes down to words, it seems.
Absolutely not. It is interesting. The press would like to say, you didn't solve it, you didn't work it out. If he didn't work it out, they would like to accuse him of being disruptive and hard to get along with and not understanding the political process. They can't have it both ways. Jesse Jackson is a winner. He's proven today that not only can he be a teacher and get someone like Dukakis understanding the importance of his work, but Dukakis announced it to the world. He needs Jesse Jackson.
So do you think that this is going to translate for all of the Jackson supporters here? Because, as I say, some of them are clearly not on board yet.
What I hear from various reporters is you have problems, people are not on board. We are not hearing that. We are hearing people say, I am with Jesse Jackson. I look for leadership from Jesse Jackson. He's our leader, and we're going to follow.
Are they going to follow Jesse Jackson or Michael Dukakis?
Jesse Jackson is the leader, Dukakis will be the recipient of Jesse Jackson's leadership, and I think that's what's happening.
Well, Dan, there's Maxine Waters' view, and I guess there's no doubt about where she stands on this. One other note I think that we should mention, and that is that someone else has told us that it was Lloyd Benson who Jesse Jackson asked to be included in his discussions today with Michael Dukakis. Lloyd Benson is credited, I'm told, with turning the discussion around, with changing the tone of that meeting. Dan?
Thank you very much, Bill. Standing by on the podium now with a glowing, and why wouldn't she be, Mrs. Dukakis, is Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Yes, Dan, Mrs. Dukakis, good evening to you again. I gather that the governor told you when you came here just to have a good time. That was his only instruction? You seem to be doing so. I saw you standing and cheering at Ann Richards' line that Vice President... You thought so. I saw you cheer when she said Vice President Bush had a silver foot in his mouth.
Right.
Did the Dukakis camp think she went far enough?
Excuse me?
Did the Dukakis camp think she went far enough in sucking it to the Republicans?
In general, it was just a forceful...
Everybody in the country assumes that today, at least this morning, the Dukakis family got together and went shh after the meeting with Jesse Jackson. Is it true?
Thank you, my friends from the state of Washington. I love you, everyone.
Who thought alike on so many of the major issues of importance. We're going to come together and be on the same team, and I'm delighted that that's happened today, and we go forward to victory, we hope, in November.
If you could send one message to Barbara Bush tonight, what would it be?
That I look forward to seeing her on the campaign trail. We've met only once, and that it's going to be a good, positive campaign, I hope.
And how about a message for her husband, the candidate, George Bush?
I hope this campaign is a campaign based on the issues, the important issues that affect all Americans.
Mrs. Dukakis, our thanks to you once again. Dan, back to you.
Thank you. Diane Sawyer with a broadly smiling Mrs. Dukakis, Kitty Dukakis. And we'll be back after these messages. A unity theme at the Democratic National Convention. Keynote speaker Ann Richards with a speech designed, among other things, to make George Bush feel that he'd been rode hard and put to bed wet. Ms. Richards trying to paint George Bush as a person out of touch with reality and someone who's not run for public office in a very long time, having mostly appointive jobs. For the platform tomorrow, Michael Dukakis and his forces agreeing at least tentatively to have floor debates on no first use of nuclear weapons by the United States, on taxes, and on the Palestinian homeland, although the agreement apparently is not to actually have a vote on that latter issue. Michael Dukakis himself not in the hall tonight, but Mrs. Dukakis is. Now that sort of brings you up to date. Leslie Stahl is with one of the more powerful political leaders in the country, this one who happens to be black, Charles Rangel of New York, who played a role in the negotiations with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Leslie?
Dan, Charles Rangel is a member of the Black Caucus, a powerful member of that caucus. I'd like to ask him what he thinks of the deal that has a deal been set, or are there serious matters left to be discussed before Jesse Jackson throws his full, total enthusiasm into the election of Michael Dukakis and Lloyd Benson?
We haven't even begun to deal. The only thing that we were able to do is to get the principals together, talking, feeling comfortable with each other, and to have them to tell their followers that they won in the campaign, to end up with mutual respect, join together.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. What do you mean the negotiations haven't even started? There is not an agreement for Jesse Jackson to go out and campaign fully, enthusiastically for this ticket?
That doesn't sound like a deal to me. You know, people said, has Dukakis capitulated? Yes. He's capitulated to the extent that he wants those people who supported Reverend Jackson to support him. He's capitulated that our best people that's been involved in the campaign will be working for him. He's capitulated that he's taken away defeat and given himself a chance to win.
What do you think when you hear people say that Jesse Jackson making demands hurts Michael Dukakis?
I can't think to make a demand
Well, unfortunately, Leslie Stahl has a good microphone for her own voice. That's the one that swung up in here, but the microphone she's putting up with Congressman Rangel is not of the best quality, and so that's the reason we broke away from that. But as I think you could hear, Congressman Rangel making the point. Yes, we're a long way down the road, but there's still much to do. And Congressman Rangel, who was deeply involved with the Reverend Jesse Jackson in negotiations with the caucus camp, making the point that he's not altogether satisfied, but he's comfortable. Now, Bob Schieffer is in the South Carolina delegation with some Jackson delegates. Bob, let's hope your microphone's better than the one Leslie Stahl had.
Well, Dan, you know, we've talked to a lot of celebrities tonight and gotten views on some powerful politicians. We thought it might be interesting to just get the views of some regular folks, some regular delegates. All of you people are Jesse Jackson folks. You liked Ann Richards' speech, but I noticed when they mentioned Lloyd Benson, I didn't see much applause over here in the South Carolina delegation. How do you feel as a Jackson delegate? Now, they say a big deal's been cut and all of that, that things are going to go smoothly. Are you disappointed? Do you think you really can get out and work for this ticket? How does it strike you?
Well, I'm not disappointed. The convention isn't over. And as a delegate, we have the opportunity to respond to several things that come to the floor. We have several minority planks that are going to be presented, and we will have an opportunity to vote on those and hopefully make an impact on the party's platform.
But you think this has all been handled well? How do you think, how do you folks feel about how all of this has been handled? Do you think it's going off all right? Do you think you're getting what you came for?
I think we are. I think it's going very smoothly. We have a good communication system, and we talked with Jesse today, and he assured us that everything is working out. All the negotiations aren't over yet, but so far it is working smooth.
How about you, ma'am? Do you think black folks are going to get out and work for this ticket?
Yes, I think we are.
Why is that?
Because we are part of the democratic process and we're here to make a difference.
And do you think that Jesse Jackson's made a difference?
He has made a difference.
You think so?
Definitely.
You're proud of him?
Very proud.
Well, that's it, Dan. Some of these folks would like to see Jesse Jackson on this ticket to be sure, but they tell us tonight they're going to work for the ticket.
Well, Bob, as you know, Lee Atwater, the high-profile negative campaign specialist for George Bush, believes water will run uphill before this ticket, the Dukakis-Benson ticket, can carry South Carolina, but we'll see. When we come back, we'll be hearing from the Pride of Plains and one of the best fly fishermen in Georgia, former President Jimmy Carter.
This portion of CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention is sponsored by Delta. Delegates travel to Atlanta on Delta Airlines, the official airline of the Democratic National Convention. CBS News coverage of Campaign 88 continues. Tonight from Atlanta, Georgia, the opening session of the Democratic National Convention. From CBS News Convention headquarters inside the Omni Arena, here again is Dan Rather.
And with the Democrats, in one way or the other, hitting on their theme, time to get the country moving again, time for a change. There's a lot of run-up just now to the next speaker here, former President Jimmy Carter. But while we wait for former President Jimmy Carter to make his actual address, let's go to the podium and Diane Sawyer with a word about the former president. Diane?
This appearance tonight might be entitled, Look Who's Back. You'll remember that just 4 years ago there was an embarrassing public dispute about whether the former president should even be allowed to appear on the podium in prime time. In the end, he was. But this year, in his home state, he's almost being treated as a star, and he's feeling it. In fact, he took perhaps the strongest swipe at Vice President George Bush anyone has taken. He told a newspaper interviewer that Mr. Bush gives off an effeminate impression and has a serious problem of silliness. Make no mistake about it, Jimmy Carter believes he's out of the woods.
And it is a driving.
Nothing is consolation for losing the presidency, but Jimmy Carter might say fly fishing comes close. He learned the sport when he was governor. Now he and his wife Rosalind can spend all the time they want searching for rainbow trout in Georgia streams. Today, the former president says his life is good, but he has spoken of his defeat in 1980 as perhaps the most painful period in his life. He was overwhelmingly rejected by the voters and came home only to find his Georgia farm steeped in debt. He turned to writing for money and for history. He has now written 7 books, no ghostwriters, as he's quick to say. He can be seen on talk shows these days promoting his most recent book, an outdoor journal about, you got it, fly fishing. President Carter can also be seen in the role of volunteer, building houses for the poor here in Georgia. He teaches at Emory University and devotes a lot of time to his Presidential Center, a think tank on public policy.
And it should be said, Dan, that if the Dukakis supporters are pleased by Mr. Carter's rehabilitation, they think it helps them in the South, they become extremely fidgety when they start hearing comparisons made. 2 governors, self-proclaimed managers, neither man raises a lot of goosebumps during a speech. In fact, Mr. Carter said of himself, he said, "I'll be off on time tonight because I'm not exactly the kind of guy who gets wild applause."
Thank you, Diane Sawyer. Ed Bradley, who covered Jimmy Carter, both as a candidate for president and as a president of the United States, is down on the floor. Ed, Jimmy Carter should know, if anybody does, something about unity after his experience in 1980 with Senator Ted Kennedy.
Well, that was one of the 2 major problems he had at this convention in 1980 was Ted Kennedy. The other problem was the problem of the hostages in Iran, and I think that was what really gave him the most fits. But he couldn't bring this convention together. He had difficulty, much like Governor Dukakis had coming in with Jesse Jackson. But you know, it's funny what time does with history is that you tend to forget the specifics. And one thing I found that people remember about Jimmy Carter was that he was a decent man, and that's the impression that people remember. And they look at the problems that President Reagan is having with hostages being held in Beirut, and I think they look more sympathetically at President Jimmy Carter now. And another thing, you think about the rehabilitation of this man, if you will, as Diane mentioned, guess who's back? You look at President Carter, last year he spoke just before Mario Cuomo, and he was dwarfed by his speech. This time he gets a featured spot.
And Ed, just as you ended, former President Jimmy Carter makes his entrance to the Democratic Convention. And with me here at our CBS News anchor booth as Jimmy Carter takes the applause, CBS News chief political correspondent Bruce Morton. Bruce, Ed Bradley raises an interesting point that Senator Kennedy, in Jimmy Carter's view, was graceless at the 1980 convention. There were people talking about Jesse Jackson being divisive at this convention. He did nothing anywhere near what Senator Kennedy did in 1980, or for that matter, what Ronald Reagan did in 1976 with Gerald Ford at Kansas City.
So far has been graceful, it seems to me. He's been very good about everything. They were shaking hands. This was a really amiable news conference this morning, as you and I saw. And nobody is angry. The picture I always remember from 1980 was that, you know, that last shot they always use. Everybody wants their hands up together. Carter sort of cruising the podium, chasing Kennedy, and Kennedy just refusing to pose for that picture. One quick handshake and out. There is not that kind of bitterness in this hall so far.
Well, Jimmy Carter, I believe, is going to speak. Sometimes at these conventions the applause waxes and wanes, but he's beginning.
When we left Washington 7.5 years ago, I invited all my Democratic friends to come to Georgia to see us. But I never expected that you would all come, and at the same time. Well, this is a grand gathering of Democrats, but there's going to be an even greater one in January when we all meet in Washington to celebrate the inauguration of Michael Dukakis as president and Lloyd Bentsen as vice president. Oh yes, I almost forgot. I have one announcement to make, which, like a lot of other things this year, may come as a bit of a surprise to the incumbent vice president. My name is Jimmy Carter, and I am not running for president. Did you hear that, George? Well, I have to admit that there are some parallels with both of our final candidates. I am a Southerner. I'm a Baptist. Some people even like to say that I love to preach. And my political career was made possible by the civil rights movement. That does sound familiar. There have been a lot of comparisons made between Mike Dukakis and myself. But I know one thing for sure. Mike Dukakis is also going from the State House to the White House. Our party has been blessed with good candidates this year. And not just this year. Wouldn't Ed Muskie have made a great president? Jesse Jackson has stirred the soul of our country. He's given hope to millions, and he's healed wounds that have too long divided us one from another. He is an inspired leader. He is destined for further greatness. Jesse, we salute you. Mike Dukakis ran a brilliant campaign of substance and respect for the intelligence of the American people. He'll be a great leader for our country. Mike is being compared to John F. Kennedy. He is from Massachusetts. He's chosen a running mate from Texas, and he's going to defeat an incumbent Republican vice president. Mike Dukakis deserves that comparison, but he reminds me of other great leaders of our party as well. Like Woodrow Wilson, he is an idealist who believes that we can be true to our own best selves in a brutal world. Like Harry Truman, he is a tough fighter. Like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he's an innovator with the courage to experiment and the confidence to find solutions. And let's be clear about one thing. We want Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen to be elected, not just so Democrats can take office in Washington, but because we know that change is long overdue. We want a federal deficit brought under control. We want a coherent foreign policy. And we want to bring back to Washington people who are more interested in public service than they are in private gain. Each of us pauses on occasion to reassess our own lives, to look at what we have become, the mistakes we've made, and to decide what we'd like to be. I think as a nation, we make this same kind of reassessment when we elect a president. Now is the time to reconsider our opportunities and our challenges, to make a change, and to decide what we want for the future, especially to decide what we want for the future. A democracy is always an unfinished creation. Each generation must rediscover the meaning of America's dream. Tonight, I'm thinking not only about the next president, but about our nation's children and how they will live in years to come. Roosevelt and I have 6 grandchildren. What kind of world will we leave to them and to other young people? In thinking about the past 8 years and looking ahead, let's recall the words of a great American president, Franklin Roosevelt. Listen to what he said. Governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes. but better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. For the sake of our children, for the sake of our future, we must melt that ice. It's time to reach out for the homeless, to families broken by drug addiction and a disease. It's time to clean up those Pentagon scandals and build a lean, tough, competent military force. It's time to have a Justice Department that fights for civil rights. It's time to quit living on credit and expecting our children to pay the bills someday. It's time to tackle the continuing problems of poverty, of a decaying environment, of the bankruptcy of family farms. And it's time to invest in the education and care of our children, because that's the kind of nation we are. That's the kind of people we are. In some ways, America is a big family. A family does not ignore the sickness or pain of any of its children. A family gives all its members help and love. That's the kind of families we have. And that's the kind of nation we want. And a good family plans for its children's future, and that means education. 8 years ago, no American student was deprived of a college education because of financial reasons. But now for many young Americans, these opportunities have been wiped out. Starting in 1989, that is going to change. We Democrats do not fear change. We welcome it, because change means hope. Change means life. Above all, change means opportunity. And no changes are more profound than those taking place in the Soviet Union. The world is fascinated with news from Moscow. General Secretary Gorbachev has made move after move that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. It's still too early to assess the permanence or sincerity of those changes. We must never forget that Mr. Gorbachev's actions are designed to help his own country, not ours. Certainly, the competition between our superpowers will remain, but it can become more peaceful and more constructive. And in that kind of competition, the United States of America has all the advantages. We have a free and creative system of government. We are strong economically. Our farmlands are highly productive. We espouse basic human freedoms and democracy. We are a religious people. We're on the cutting edge of technological and scientific progress. Our neighbors are our friends and not our slaves.